Welcome to our next practice weekly conversation this week, where we're going to be focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're so happy to have you here with us. So let's jump right into it. I love to start by just grounding us in a quote for today. And this is a quote shared by our special guest today. The quote is, "There's always light if we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." And that, of course, is from Amanda Gorman from the poem, "The Hill We Climb." So we're going to get started with this conversation, but before anything, I just want to say thank you for being here and just go over a couple of notes as we get started. I4CP is a research firm that discovers the people practices of high-performance organizations. I4CP does more human capital research than anyone on the planet, always with the focus on what do high-performing organizations do differently than low-performing organizations. So we help you, your head of HR and the HR leadership team, see what's coming around the curve so you can make better human capital decisions. And we do this by sharing with you the successful and the next practices that really drive high performance. And so if you haven't picked up on it already, everything we do is rooted in high performance organizations. So I'm going to take a moment here to explain to you how we really define that. When our analysts conduct any research study, we are looking at organizations that excel in 4 key areas, and that's revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction. And so we're not only looking at what do high performance organizations do differently than low performance organizations. And, 99% of the time, there is a big difference. But through regression analysis, we look at what specific practices are providing that bottom line business impact. And we look at this over a 5-year time horizon because things do change rapidly. That's something that we all know. So our community plays a huge role in what we do, from contributing to not only the research studies we conduct, but really driving the direction of our research agenda, as well as providing direct support to fellow members. We're fortunate to conduct research studies where we are drawing from a database of roughly 20,000 organizations worldwide. So we always have a great mixture of national, multinational, and global companies contributing to our research. And we're really pleased to include the many well-known, respected organizations on this page as I4CP members. So this might be a good time to actually introduce myself. My name is Amber Burton. I am a senior research analyst here at I4CP and happy to join you all and lead the conversation today. But I'm also joined by my colleague, Eric Davis. Eric, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Amber. Good to be here.
Wonderful. Eric is the creative director and senior editor here at I4CP, and he is also the lead researcher for our Chief Diversity Officer board. Eric, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Awesome. Of course, we're going to be joined today for a discussion with Rohini Anand, but before that, we're going to be going through just some reminders and announcements. Some upcoming events we have. Our next practice weekly call is actually going to be with Christy Feldkamp, the Global Head of Talent and Learning, and Danish Ahmad, Chief of Staff and Head of Strategy, Corporate Affairs at HP. That's next week. And then on February 20th, we're going to have our next practice weekly call with Buddy Binge, Global Head of Talent Insights at Edward Jones. So please register, join us for those. There's sure to be some great conversations. We are a research organization, so we have some exciting research coming around the bend. One thing that's top of mind for us right now is organizations, employees, and work. They are more distributed today than ever before. So what does it take to be a successful global leader in today's environment? That's what we want to find out. So we invite you to participate in I4CP's global study on leadership effectiveness. We're going to seek to identify the capabilities that really distinguish successful leaders in the era of distributed work and exploring the importance of agility, scale, sustainability, and the practices and leadership skills that really drive high performance. So you see here, there's a QR code. You can go ahead and scan that QR code, or we'll drop a link as well for you to go ahead and complete that survey by February 7th. When you complete that survey, you'll actually receive exclusive early access to the results, which enables, benchmarking against industry leaders. So really encourage you to do that, and it's sure to have some interesting findings as well. Workforce readiness in the era of AI. We are really proud of this one. This is our latest study that has come out. This new I4CP research shows that on average, workers believe they could increase their productivity by 10 to 30% if they had more AI related skills. Highly encourage you to check this report out. It is dynamic. Our team did an awesome job pulling this together. And it's not just focused on AI readiness and what you should be raising your gaze to right now, but workforce readiness as a whole. How do you know if your workforce is ready for what's coming around the bend? So check that out. QR codes here. We'll drop the link as well. If you want to hear a little bit more about that study that just came out, my colleague Catherine Brecken and I will be presenting on the report. You can find out who those leading companies are who are leading the way in AI adoption. Please register at the link or the QR code as well, and we're going to hop into it. So Rohini Anand is the chair of I4CP's Chief Diversity Officer Board and a renowned author and strategic DEI advisor. She's the former corporate responsibility and global chief diversity officer at Sodexo. And today, Rohini will share her key insights from her acclaimed book, Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, a guide for systemic change in multinational organizations. Rohini, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Amber. It's just wonderful to see all the messages in the chat, people joining in from all over the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I'm very happy to be here in conversation with you, Amber.
Oh, thank you. Well, I love to start these conversations by, I can read your bio and share as much about you all day, but I like for everyone to hear it in your own words. So can you tell everyone just a little bit more about your career journey in your own words and what brought you to where you are today in this conversation?
Yeah, thank you for that question. But if you don't mind, I'm going to start with, for those that dialed in earlier when you heard the song Imagine, John Lennon, I picked that song very strategically because it really does capture the sentiment for today. So the lyrics really speak to, I think, what we need really, in today, based on what's happening today. It says, imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. I think this sort of, sets the stage for what is needed today. So I just wanted to, call that out before I talked about myself. So yeah, thanks for that question. And I'll say that, I've been involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion and corporate responsibility for many years. And for those that are in this space, that are in HR, you know that it's very personal. This work is very personal, as it is for me. I did see that there were some people that dialed in from India, and I actually grew up in India. And growing up in India, I was surrounded by others like me. I belonged to the majority religion, Hinduism. And being part of the majority in India, I never had to think about my identity. So I had the privilege of not thinking about my identity. That was, before I moved to North America as a young single immigrant woman. And my identity shifted from being someone who saw herself as the center of her world to being a foreigner, to being an immigrant, and to being a minority. And it was through that sort of change in my perspective and experience and how I was identified was very pivotal. And that's when I realized the privileges that came with being part of a majority. I was part of the majority growing up in India, but I'd never reflected on my privilege in that way till I was identified as a minority. So really, being an outsider, being a minority is at the heart of DEI work. And, it was my own personal experience that brought me to this work. I was in academia. I did a couple of different stints, and then I finally joined Sodexo. And you mentioned that in the bio. And I joined Sodexo because it's a food and facilities company, but a global company. So, at the time, there were 480,000 employees in over 85 countries. So it was a microcosm of the world, right? So for me, this was an amazing opportunity. Also, the CEO was very committed, and that's really what sold me. But here's the interesting part. So I joined Sodexo at a very difficult time in the company's history. They had a class action lawsuit filed by the African American managers in the United States. It was a promotion discrimination lawsuit. And initially, I kind of questioned the wisdom of the CEO. I thought, here I am. I'm not African American, and he's hiring someone who's Asian American to address this lawsuit. But I have to say that, other than that sort of pivotal experience of my move from India to North America, this particular experience was absolutely life-changing for me because I learned how to listen deeply to the lived experiences of others who are different from mine. Their lived experiences were very different from mine, but I listened deeply. And it was through that experience of building bridges with the community, the African American community, but also the predominantly white managers, that I learned and grew into my role. And I have to say that if it had not been for the generosity of spirit of those Black managers at Sodexo, I would not have been successful. So that's sort of, the journey. It was a personal journey, brought me to Sodexo. And it was that sort of life-changing experience that brought me to the work that I do and continues to influence the work that I do today. I left Sodexo just before COVID hit, wrote my book. And since then, I've been working with executive teams, I've been coaching chief diversity officers, and I'm on several boards. Love the work that I do. And of course, I'm the chair of the I4CP CDO board. So yeah, thanks for that question, Amber.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that story. I think that resonates with a lot of people here, and we can really connect with that. You also shared a wonderful quote, that quote that I shared at the top of the call today. Share a little bit more about why it's meaningful to you at this time in particular.
Yeah, so I think, both the song that we heard as well as the quote, I think this is a time where now more than ever, we have to remain resilient. We've got to remain hopeful, both in the United States and around the world. And I don't say that lightly because I think this sort of fight for equity and inclusion is not just a battle for the present, but it really is about a legacy for the future. So I think that, we've got to stay focused, we've got to stay resilient. We've got to rethink and reimagine how we do this work, how we do diversity, equity, and inclusion work, whatever that may be, how we reinvent it and continue to really lead into doing it and not get sort of intimidated or shy away from doing this work. It may look different, but it's critical. Our employees want it, our customers want it, everyone in this call wants it. So, I mean, I think that's what that quote, why it speaks to me, because as she says, as Amanda Gorman says, because there's always light and we must be brave enough to see it and be it. There's always hope. We've got to hold on to that. We've got to be resilient. We've got to be brave. We've got to be willing to take risks because this is about a legacy for the future. So that quote really, for me, really speaks to these times.
Absolutely. And I think it gets right to the heart of why everyone is here on this call today. And I think it really, really is something that kind of brings us together just in purpose. And so I appreciate that. I think that sets a great foundation for the conversation we're about to have. Why don't we just kind of get a base level of where everyone's at? Eric, why don't you kick us off with a poll question?
Sure. Thank you, Amber. Yeah, we have a couple of polls that we're going to insert into the conversation today. Mostly we want to get a little temperature check right now. So our first one, we want to check first on what the global footprint of some of the people who are dialing in are. We saw some people chime in chat, but we know this has a big effect on the news that's been coming out of the US lately. And then we also want to know, to what extent do you think DEI backlash in the US is affecting strategies outside the US? So Rohini, I know you've been in a lot of conversations with people lately. Just based on the conversations you're having, what kind of results do you think we're going to see on this poll?
Yeah, I'm looking at this, and I don't know how many folks have responded, but it looks like many are US based, but also US based global, which is what I would expect. And then to what extent I'm seeing sort of, high, low, moderate, none. Yeah, I'm not surprised. I think given the organizations that are represented on this call, Eric,
Mhm.
Most of them are US based, either domestic or global. So I would imagine that, it is impacting what's happening outside the United States as well. But what I'm finding is that a lot of organizations outside the United States, and we can talk more about this, but they're quite confused. They don't quite know how to, sort of figure out what's going on in the US. I've been getting calls from European-based organizations saying, help us understand what we can and cannot do. We're, federal government contractors. What should we avoid? What can we lean into and continue doing? So it is having, as they say, when the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. So I'm not surprised. But I'm also seeing that outside of the United States, the commitment is really continuing. So I think there is this sort of strong, and there may be a lag effect, but I'm just finding that, outside the United States, a commitment to DEI is continuing. It, may have an effect at some point, but at least for now, I think it's pretty strong. So I'm not surprised by these results, given who's, the companies that are on the call.
And I'd have to agree. I mean, we know that federal workers are being severely impacted in the US, federal contractors, but I know the CDOs that we talked to recently, a lot of them say they're staying the course. They're continuing with the work, and they're really hopeful that this can be a change moment for the field where, we really address the best practices and embrace where we can go forward and make the work more impactful. So are we showing the results now? All right, I think everybody can see those. Yeah. All right. So with that, I think I will kick this back to you, Amber, and then later on we have another poll that we're going to get into. So
Great.
thank you.
Well, yeah, we'll go ahead and hop into the first question we have today. Let's see here. So we've seen various executive orders come from the White House in the past couple of weeks, which have led many to believe they need to reframe their DEI programs. And we're going to be talking a lot about what that means today.
Right.
But what does reframing look like to you?
Yeah, so I think it answers I'll try and answer one of these questions that just popped up as well, Amber, in terms of, the executive orders and why do they want to see such a massive shift in DEI, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's the questions there that really speak to your question or amplifies your question. So you're right. And, in just 48 hours, there were 3 executive orders that were passed, right? So the first one was ending diversity in the federal government. The second was recognizing that there are 2 unchangeable sexes. And the third is revoking President Johnson's executive order 11246. So that particular executive order was targeted at federal contractors and had them refrain from employment discrimination, and they would have to take affirmative actions to ensure that there are equal opportunities based on race, color, national origin, and religion. So in basically revoking that executive order, what has happened is that it sort of enshrines the status quo. And in some senses, what I like to say is it sort of reinforces affirmative action for white men. And it intimidates the private sector. So it's taking away any guardrails, any safeguards to avoid discrimination. And it's basically taking away any remedies to systemic discrimination. But what is important here for folks in this call to understand is, despite these executive orders, nothing has changed for the corporate sector if you're doing it right, right? Nothing has changed if you're doing it right, because it does not require private employees to abandon their diversity efforts. Our efforts in corporate America are guided by Title VII, which is a law of the Civil Rights Act, okay? So which basically says that you cannot use race and gender in making employment decisions, in making talent decisions. And that remains. So what I would say is that this is a time to really re-look carefully at your diversity efforts, your HR talent efforts, to reframe them. So what does that look like? It looks like doing a risk assessment, taking a look at all your processes and making sure that they're compliant with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, that you're not using race or gender, race and gender not being taken into account in making people decisions, right? It also means that your initiatives that you have are open to everyone. So for instance, if you have mentoring, if you have leadership development that is targeted at a specific identity group, and there are many leadership development programs, for instance, that are targeted just at women, as an example, right? Make sure that those are open to everyone. So you can say that, look, you're welcome to join, but what you're going to understand is the barriers that women encounter in the workplace and strategies to overcome them, right? But have it open to everyone, just as your employee resource group should be open to everyone. Now, if you were doing this right from the start, right, if you did have initiatives that were open to everyone, that people, felt like they could belong, that they could identify with the diversity efforts, you don't have to change anything. But take a look with your legal counsel, take a hard look at your initiatives and make sure that they're compliant with Title VII, because that's what you need to focus on, okay? That's the part that needs to be, that is important. Also, what I would say is that, continue looking at demonstrating business value through data-driven insights, okay? So how are your diversity efforts impacting your business in a positive way? Whether if it's talent, if it's STEM talent, how is what you're doing impacting the numbers of, STEM talent across the board, right? So I think that's important to really look at. Or how is it increasing market share? Make sure you're looking at that. And then I would say that, I think it's also time to explain what DEI is and is not. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a zero-sum game, right? Make sure that we sort of focus on that, demonstrate the business value. So to me, this is really about re-examining what you're doing, making sure that you are doing it right, that it's open to everyone, everyone feels a part of it, that, reaffirm your commitment because your employees want it. I mean, on the call yesterday, this is Black History Month in the United States. And in some of the federal government departments, like Department of Defense, they have said that they're not going to celebrate Black History Month or any of the Federal Heritage Month celebrations. But in corporate America, you should be continuing to do that because your employees want it. I mean, this is about engagement of your employees. This is about retention of your employees. And, they're looking for messaging from the organization. So think, and reaffirm your commitment, focus on the psychological safety of your employees, because that's what's critical. Look, Amber, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion has always encountered headwinds, right? If you think about it, we've always responded to the external environment and moved from compliance to, having diversity as an enabler of business success, to addressing social justice and racial equity after the murder of George Floyd, to moving back to, to sort of, responding to the backlash against the woke agenda. So we've always responded to these headwinds. This is no different. Okay, it's just a question of reframing what you're doing, and some are actually re-looking at the language.
Yeah,
Right?
I think you hit right on it. It's always had to be an incredibly agile function, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. And I can just virtually hear a bunch of people taking notes right there because you laid that out so clearly for what people need to remember, and remembering that employees are at the heart of it all. What is it that they want at this time? Eric, I think this is a good place to bring back in another poll question for us here. Let's see. Yeah.
Okay, and this is one we're doing across all of our DEI calls that we've been doing lately. Probably end up in a future article that we're going to write, but is your organization redefining its diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts? And then has your organization made an internal statement about its DEI work? And Rohini, I know we've sat through this poll now a few times together to see how people respond to it. But I'm also seeing like a lot of people in chat. So I think as they're answering this, maybe some of those questions we might want to start surfacing, because there seems to be a lot of confusion between what is EEOC law, what is affirmative action, how is that different, and what is the difference between that and DEIA work. And also, we have some questions about, why is DEI work generally only associated with certain groups, people of color, women, where a lot of other people and organizations feel like they're left out of the equation.
Yeah. So in terms of the poll, how is your organization responding? Is your organization redefining its efforts? Again, not surprising. Yes, no, and still deciding. I think, this is to me one of those things where, and then this, let me just read the second one. Have you made an internal statement? Yes, no, planning to. So I think this is one of those things, you have organizations making headline news, right? I think today the latest was Google, because these are organizations that are moving away from representation goals, and it makes this big splash. But what I'm finding is there are some organizations that are retreating. Many organizations are waiting and watching. But the majority of organizations that are I4CP members and others are basically continuing their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but in a way that's reframed. So it may be about looking at how they're naming the function. Many are dropping the diversity. They're focusing on belonging and inclusion and accessibility, but they're continuing the work. Many of them are looking inwards. So they're not making these, big commitments externally for racial justice causes. They're doing it maybe under the radar, but it is continuing. So I think that would be the one thing that, that I would say. And then I think you had a bunch of different questions. There's one here about, what about corporations who have federal contracts? Will it eventually impact them? I think you've got to be, I think as Amber said, we've always responded to headwinds, right? It's a very agile function. And I think you've just got to be agile. And as a federal government contractor, yes, it may mean reframing, it may mean renaming, it may mean, sort of putting it under a talent umbrella, whatever it is. I have, I look at this particularly around the name in two ways, right? One is, a part of me says, which other function changes its name when it's under attack? I don't know of any function, right? But on the other hand, if I'm being more practical, I say, what difference does a name mean so long as the work continues and the impact is there? That's where I am right now, because I think the times are different, and I can't get stuck on the name. I think it's about the work. So you've just got to be smart about how you're doing it and what you're calling it. Do they have the option to continue hiring representation goals and comply with the new law? I do think this is one, I don't want to give legal advice here, but I think you've got to start talking with your legal counsel to see how you do this. There are other ways of kind of continuing DEI work without talking about sort of representation goals, because that could be something that may be a little bit more at risk. But there are other ways of sort of talking about culture change by linking sort of inclusive leadership behaviors and holding leaders accountable for those. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But does that answer a lot of some of the stuff that you raised? Anything else that you want me to speak to?
I think it does, and I think it is important. It's like, be very in touch with your legal counsel when you're discussing these things. You guys should be in lockstep. Really look at the associated risk. Federal contractors, like we said, are going to have a lot more than others. Plus, as we're going to get into more on this call, there's not only state and regional laws that still come into effect for contractors and for all employers, but there's laws globally.
Yeah.
That still need to be considered. So, Amber, I think.
Can I just add one other thing? Because it's one of the pieces here. What are your insights about how to address the ambiguity or confusion of DEI that it seems solely associated with people of color. I think this is where, when I talked about reframing and doing your risk evaluation, you've got to, I mean, work around diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a bunch of programs for any one group. It's about removing barriers and making your organization inclusive for everybody. White men have to see themselves as part of this narrative, right? I know when I advise people to do mentoring initiatives, I always say, I said, look, mentoring is about removing barriers for everyone. Everyone should be able to participate, but if there are more barriers for a particular group, make sure that those individuals are part of your mentee group, right? So ensure ERGs, they've got to be open to everybody, because I can learn. I mean, I talked about my own sort of journey around, understanding or listening to, empathizing with the lived experiences of my Black colleagues, right? If I join an African-American employee resource groups, that gives me exposure to lived experiences of others. So everyone should be able to join, because everyone will be better as a result of it. So that's where I think we've got to really start shifting the focus, if you're not doing it already. A lot of organizations are, but that's the myth, about that this is just for one group. No, it's about removing barriers. Some like people of color, like women, have more barriers in the workplace, and we've got to unpack and address those. So we stop there, Amber.
Yeah, I think that focus on removing barriers is, I mean, it's at the center of it all. And that's a value that has to be embedded within an organization. And so, I mean, that actually leads right to our next question, which was, what can organizations do to make sure DEI is more embedded within their DNA, because that's the only way it would be effective. So what
Yeah.
can they do? Yeah.
So I think, Amber, I mean, yesterday there was a lot, when we asked them, what's your top priority? Most of the folks said embedding, diversity into all the functions across the organization. It has got to be, and I actually talk about this, saying it has to be deep, wide, and inside out, right? So you've got to have it at all levels in the organization, champions and ambassadors at all levels in the organization. That's the deep. The wide is scale it, globally. Because, have governance structures that help you to scale that. And then, make sure that you're also attuned to the external environment. But I do think that, looking at all the touch points, if you look at the talent pipeline, ensuring that DEI is embedded into how and who you hire, okay? You can actually assess for leaders' commitments to diversity through sort of narratives and through what they say in terms of their own journeys when you hire. So make sure you have it right from the hiring, the development, the promotion, the retention, the engagement, link it, in all of, and then hold your leaders accountable. Very often companies have had representation goals and incentives linked to those representation goals, and now they're questioning whether they can do that, which is justified given the noise, because you don't want to be in the spotlight. But on the other hand, there are other ways of embedding and holding managers accountable for inclusive leadership behaviors, which should be part of good leadership regardless. Hold managers accountable for those inclusive leadership behaviors. If you look at marketing and product development, and there's, one case example that I will share is from Charter Communications. I'm on the External Diversity Advisory Board. And it was fascinating when I heard this, because what they did was they had people with disabilities sit alongside their product development folks to develop products that were accessible, including, they have this voice-enabled, TV remote, okay, for those that are not sighted. So, but what they realized was that was just one piece. So when I talk about all the touch points, that was just one piece of ensuring accessibility. And the example that they shared with me was, let's say you have the best accessible tools, TV remote that someone who's not sighted can use, it's voice enabled, but you have a technician going to the home of someone who's not sighted, and he or she leaves the tools on the ground, and this customer trips over those tools, right? It really negates the whole experience for this individual, because you can have the best accessible tools, but right here, you've not paid attention to this person who's not sighted. So they went back and they looked at all the customer touch points and embedded accessibility into all those touch points through training, etc. So I think that's the kind of thing we have to do, is to really embed it, everywhere. And then I think you have to demonstrate the impact with hard numbers. In this particular case, they were able to say that they touched 6.7 million subscribers that were people with disabilities, 6.7 million subscribers. So what they did, had a monetary impact on the business. When I was working at Sodexo, we were able to demonstrate that we touched $1 billion worth of business through diversity, for clients. So whether this was through providing access, sales presentations, retention, consulting, it was a large portfolio that basically was touched by my team. So show those hard numbers. And I think those are the kinds of things we need to, be doing in terms of embedding it at all of the touch points that you can think of.
Well, that's an awesome reminder and just such a great case example. Thank you for that. I think another piece of this that we're thinking about a lot is, the alignment that you still need across the organization. So, in this very polarized environment, with leaders on every side of the political spectrum, what can you do to bring leaders along on this journey and buy into the real value of DEI that you've discussed here? Because that's still a challenge as well.
Yeah. So, I think that I often say that change happens at the intersection of people and processes. Okay. We've been talking about processes, but remember they're human beings, and you have to impact those human beings. And very often when you make the other human, it can really impact people's worldview. So you've got to be able to disrupt people's worldview. And that happens through, giving them experiences, right? So let me share a very quick story with you. And I'm seeing some other sort of questions coming through in the chat, but this very quick story is the CEO that I reported to was a straight white Frenchman. And we had this global gender strategy. In the United States, we had, a strategy around race and ethnicity. And I had started to socialize that in Europe, where, as you know, race does not translate in the same way as it does in the US, okay? But I had started to sort of unpack that. And he said to me one time, he said, why are you raising issues of race in Europe where it's really not relevant? And let's just focus, you're diluting the focus on gender. So I realized that I needed to bring him along, right? And sort of disrupt his worldview in some way. So I invited him to the African American ERG meeting in North America. He was one of two Frenchmen in that room, one of a handful of white men in that room. And he attended these, they had simulated what was a barber shop and a beauty parlor, where a lot of very personal conversations happen. And he listened to the lived experiences of the Black men, many of them senior executives who he worked alongside, but had not listened to their lived experience. It was very, very transformational for him. And, he went away from that experience basically his worldview was shaken. He got some glimpse into issues of race, and he sent a very heartfelt message to the organization after the murder of George Floyd, basically talking about the personal impact on him. So when I talk about, how can you show them, how can you sort of bring these leaders along? I think it has to be a combination of data and the business impact. I talked about the $1 billion. When you show that to a leader, I mean, they're convinced. But you also have to bring them along on an emotional level, because giving them sort of these experiences, and because it has to be both and I firmly believe in the humanity in people. So yeah, I think that's important. Does that answer your question?
It does, and it kind of just, I've spoken to a lot of companies just about culture renovation in general. How do they enact major change throughout an organization? And a lot of times it comes back to that storytelling, and that's a tenet that you hit on here. And I think that's something that's going to become even more important. I did want to pause for some of the questions and comments. Eric, what are you all seeing in the comments?
So I did see one. I'm trying to understand how to do all of this without having guidance from OFCCP. Example, developing diversity outreach goals. Again, we can't really give legal advice around anything like this, but I think you sort of answered that in a way when it's like, okay, there are other ways to reach the same goals that you're trying to reach. There's no limitations right now, even if you're a federal contractor, on going to HBCUs and setting up there when you're looking for talent, or what talent pipelines you direct towards. There's not necessarily a need to change any of that. And there's other work within the organization, within the culture, that can be done that can just make your organization more appealing and make sure that you can keep and retain the talent that you have. So, Rohini, I don't know if you had any other way
No,
that
I
you.
think you answered it. I think you answered that question. I think, there's one question here about thoughts and recommend. There's lots of questions, folks. I think we've got to get
Mhm.
answers to these, but recommendations for global companies and how you begin to digest disclosing representation information in support of both the changes happening in the US, but also the EU sustainability reporting efforts. I mean, I think the EU reporting efforts basically are, remain unchanged. In the United States, I think that, not having targets, representation goals is something that some organizations are discussing with their legal counsels. But you can certainly, report the numbers. I don't think there's any issue there. It's a question of what are you doing then to sort of, change those numbers. And that's where you get into some sort of gray area. So just be careful of that. And then there's one, how do you prove the positive financial impact of continuing diversity initiatives? I think I heard something about this from the speaker, but missed the basis of the report. So I think you've got to understand your business and then figure out how you can sort of, advance the goals of your business, right? So if it is about, hiring, best STEM talent, then focus your efforts on that and demonstrate how you've made a difference. So you've got to understand what the pain points are and address those. The example I gave was, when I was at Sodexo, one of the things that they obviously wanted to grow their client base. And what we were able to do is to demonstrate that through diversity, because we were a leader in that space, it became a differentiator and a competitive advantage. And through diversity, we were able to actually access clients. We were able to, get new business because we would lead with diversity. And we started to quantify that. So that's an example. The other example I have is we did a study, which was a gender balance study. And, we had talked about, the business benefit of diversity and the leaders were not quite buying into it. So we did this study where we looked at gender balanced teams or teams with 40 to 60% women around the world and gathered data from about 50,000 managers in over 70 entities around the world. And what we found was the gender balanced teams or teams with 40 to 60% women outperformed those with less than 40% women, okay, on each one of the organization's 5 key performance indicators. So here's what I'm saying. You've got to link, you've got to understand the pain points, and you've got to link your diversity efforts to the business. So the 5 key performance indicators were safety, client retention, employee engagement, and financial outcomes. And on each one of those 5, gender balanced teams outperformed those that were not gender balanced. But when you got more than 60% women on any sort of entity, the results started plateauing. So the whole point here is that you've got to have that optimal mix for inclusion and for productivity. So whatever makes your business tick, understand it and link what you're doing to that. So let me stop there. I think I've answered a couple of those questions.
Yeah, and that's a great example. I do want to kind of move the conversation, kind of talking about the more global perspective here. And so I do want to know, how is the pullback in the US going to affect our global strategies? What does it look like to continue to do the work on a global scale? And you started to touch on that, but I think we should maybe click a little bit deeper on this one. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, what I'm finding is, and I think folks here, can speak to it. I think what I'm finding is it's beginning, people are trying to make sense of this. Let me put it this way. So you have companies that are headquartered outside of the United States that maybe have federal government contracts, and they are concerned about what they can and cannot do. So, my guidance to them is, again, speak to your legal folks. You do not have to change things out, but what you need to do is to reframe what you're doing, right? So it may mean, and lot of organizations are relooking at the name. And as I said, my Rohini today says, that's okay, so long as you're doing the work that, this work is about, the equity work. You've got to also be able to, I would say, a lot of organizations are not being overtly visible. So, pulling back from some of the external stuff that they're doing and making big, announcements and splashes. So I think that those are the kinds of things that, those organizations that are outside the US are trying to figure out, right? I think US headquartered organizations with a global footprint, should continue to work on their global strategy. I don't think that needs to change in any way, shape, or form. This is, limited to the United States. I know there'll be a trickle effect, but I think this may be a time for us to learn from what's happening outside the United States. I think this is an opportunity for organizations outside the United States to, sort of showcase what they're doing. So I'll just, leave it there, but I think there's going to be an impact. I think we're all figuring it out. But I do think that the work outside the United States does not need to be impacted right now.
Yeah, I agree that I think everyone's just figuring it out across the board, no matter where they're located. And you had mentioned earlier, DEI is defined differently around the
Right.
world, and the focus of regional programs can really vary. So I'm wondering, do you think does it make it easier or harder to adjust the strategy with those differences?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, just to speak to that, there are different ways of doing sort of global transformation work, right? So one is what I call universal, which is top down. So strategy is developed somewhere, uniformly executed around the world. The pros are it's faster, it's quicker, it's cheaper. There's some sort of consistency, but the downside is that it's very hard to adopt because it's not relevant in other parts of the world very often. I'll give you two very quick examples in that, Amber. So I was working with one particular client, and they had developed this race training in the United States, rolled it out across the world. When I spoke to the teams in India, they said they had something called a hot button activity where you had to respond to certain words. And the two words that they expected a response from was abortion and guns. Now, in the United States, these are very polarizing issues, right? Guns and abortion, very polarizing. In India, even the cops don't have guns, and abortion is legal. So, the question was, okay, so what? It was not polarizing. And this person in India said to me, the whole training was completely irrelevant. If they had words like divorce and religion, they may have gotten some kind of a response from us. So, I think it's cheaper, faster, quicker, but it's got to be sort of, relevant in that part of the world. The other way of doing this work is very local, right? So it's very, very, very regional, very, very local. And there, what you miss out is sort of best practice sharing across borders, which sometimes sparks change and innovation because you're just not learning from outside. Yes, it's relevant to that particular locale, but it's so local that it just, there's very little progress or learning that happens. So transversal approach is one that I recommend, which is where you have sort of a global framework with flexibility to adapt it locally. There were questions in this chat about sort of reporting and stuff. So let me just address that question through this example. So the strategy has to be able to be localized. So if you look at race, for example, right? Issues of race are extremely politically charged. They're talked about in code or not talked about at all. they're very fluid. They're shaped by the contours of history and culture of a particular location. So you can't use a cookie cutter approach. You cannot report in a cookie cutter way either. And every sort of area has its own dominant and subordinate groups, right? So in the United States, for example, race might be the driving social force, but in other parts of the world, race may be one of the several identities that divide. So it may be sort of uh, tangled up with ethnicity, with caste, with religion, and race may play a less prominent role. And if we expect and see race in just one way, then we may miss some of those nuances locally and regionally based on, discrimination based on religion or caste in India, or, sort of ethnic nuances in politics in Kenya or other parts of Africa. So going back to the reporting piece, the questions that came up. So for instance, in France and many parts of Europe, it's forbidden to gather data on race and ethnicity. And this race was actually struck from the Constitution of France in 2018. And this was in response to the persecution of Jewish people and the effort to rebuild Europe after World War II. So many of the countries, including France, redefine themselves as indivisible, and they don't identify people by community affiliation, but rather by what they call sort of objective criteria, like citizenship and migration. So that the state can't use, this sort of identity data for state action. And it makes it very frustrating, for instance, for those from the United States going there to say, we can't report on numbers, but it also makes it frustrating for those from Europe who sort of see this sort of, reporting on issues of race as something which is very alien. So in the reporting requirements, certainly, in Europe, you do have to report, but report on gender. And then there are other reporting requirements in some countries around disabilities, because there are disability quotas, for example. But what's interesting is that, one particular organization that I worked with, a nonprofit, they actually gathered some of this data, but they asked questions about, in France, but they asked questions about your parents' and grandparents' ethnicity and education level. And the reaction was very interesting, because for those in France, they said, that's fine, we're happy to provide that. But the American companies were really upset, because they said, this is, sort of confidential information, and we're not going to provide that, but we can provide you, information about race and ethnicity. So I think this creates that sort of, dichotomy in terms of, making sure that you have a strategy, but it is localized to your question. And in terms of the reporting requirements, I do think, you can, in Europe, there are different reporting requirements. Certainly, you cannot report on race and ethnicity in Europe. That's, not permissible.
Thank you for just painting a good picture of that nuance there, and just kind of explaining the why. That's really important to keep top of mind here. Our last question today, I can't believe this time has just flown by, but
So can I just, someone
yeah,
said in India, abortion is legal only if the mother's life is endangered, and he's right about that.
good point. Yes, thank you for pointing that out. Our last question today is just, what questions should leaders be asking right now? It can be easy to get distracted, but what should leaders really be focused on? If you said there's just one thing, you're at a mentorship lunch and you're telling them, bring it back down here. What should they be asking or thinking about?
I think, they should be asking about their risk tolerance. Let's take a look at what we're doing. What is our risk tolerance? Let's look at all the efforts that we have. Make sure that they're aligned with what we can and cannot do. And let's, consider our risk tolerance in terms of where we can push, and then, bring it down to, what is really going to make a difference for our organization. Let's focus in on that and take out all the other noise, the extraneous stuff.
Oh, this was such an awesome and dynamic conversation. I think I speak for everyone when I say we could just keep talking about this all afternoon, all day. So thank you, Rohini, for joining us. I'm sure we will have you back again soon. Eric, I will pass it over to you to close.
All right. And thank you so much, Rohini. I would just like to share one thing that I think a lot of us have heard over and over again since the executive orders has come down. And that's just remember, if you weren't doing anything illegal before the executive orders came out, you're not doing something illegal now. There's different risk tolerance. There's different things that are going on in organizations, but work with your legal counsel. And just remember that the work does need to continue. So to wrap things up, as we do every week, I wanted to give a reminder that our next Practices Now conference is coming up fast. It's less than a month away. This is a premier vendor-free event, and it'll be from March 3rd through the 6th in sunny Scottsdale, Arizona. As I said, there's no vendors, no consultants, just top people leaders, academics, and thought leaders. And we have about 500 attending each year. What you can see here on this slide is just a small sample of some of the speakers we have lined up. If you're interested in attending, you can use the QR code on the slide or just go to i4cp.com/conference for more information. We'd love to see you all there in person, especially the people that we connect with every week here on Next Practices Weekly. And lastly, if you've attended this call today, it's available as a recertification credit hour for both HRCI and SHRM certifications. So just jot down the appropriate program ID code, which would also be posted in chat. Once again, thank you, Rohini and Amber, for an excellent and insightful discussion. We hope to see you all back next Thursday and every Thursday for Next Practices Weekly. And until then, have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.